Got a great film to play,
Hello?
Have you ever snubbed a lady?
We had a technical problem.
Are we on?
Yeah, we're on there.
Can I swear? Shit!
Welcome to Crunch and Roll, a podcast about the side of the radio industry that most people never hear about, featuring some of its most interesting characters. My name is John Fox, and having presented the odd breakfast show here and there around the country over the last 2.5 decades, I'm pretty well qualified to probe my guests and find out the stuff that others can't. Now, I've done a few breakfast shows, as I've said, but I tended to get sacked after about 5 years into each of them, usually because I'd called the PD something I shouldn't have, or I'd slept in one too many times. But my guest today is the absolute don of breakfast show longevity, Steve Pauэр. He presented breakfast on Wave 105 for 17 years. There's basically Wogan, then him. More recently, he's been on afternoons until, well, if you're listening to this episode when it was released last week, Wave has finally succumbed to Greatest Hits Radioification, and Steve finds himself replaced with some young upstart called Simon Mayo? Never heard of him. What a career, though. From making the tea at BBC Sussex to running Southern FM and Power FM, there is plenty to talk about. Like the time he was booked for a PA because a nightclub owner thought he was someone else, how he took being called a second-rate Neil Fox as a compliment, and also an insight into Radar days with Richard Park as your boss. It's a good one. Now, before we start, another reminder that if you do enjoy the podcast and you are a regular listener, as always, eternally grateful if you could support us on Ko-fi. Just go to ko-fi.com/crunch and roll. 17 years on breakfast, an absolute stalwart of the industry. Got a crap mic. Let's crunch and roll. Oh, yeah. Steve, how are you?
Very well, thanks, John.
It's lovely to meet you, and thank you so much. We've been desperate to get you on Crunch and Roll for some time now, and we've finally tracked you down.
Well, thank you very much. I'm a big devotee of it. I've been listening to all the pearls of wisdom of some of my favourite broadcasters. Alex Lester, I thought, was amazing. To hear Dirk Anthony's voice again after all these years was brilliant as well. So, yeah, it's a really great podcast.
Do you know, it's really nice to get you on for many reasons. And one of the reasons, because I'm a dirty northerner, obviously my life in radio was apart from 210 FM, where I dipped my toe in the south slightly, I was mainly up north. And I knew very little of southern radio. And, of course, that's where you spent your time, isn't it, down there?
Yes, I mean, in terms of stations, basically, I didn't get north of Northampton. So it was about the only north that I ever had an association with. So, yeah, my prime part of my career has been spent on the south coast. And in fact, I grew up in Taunton in Somerset. I was a Somerset boy. Obviously, as I grew up, we had BBC Radio Bristol. That was it. There was no commercial radio at that stage. We had nothing like media studies to actually ignite your interest in the medium or the industry. We had careers teachers that would come in and ask you what you'd like to do. And when I said, I'd quite like to go into radio or be a DJ, they said, yes, that's very nice, but you need to get a proper job. And it was really the days of train drivers, vets, very traditional positions.
Before we get onto your radio career, Steve, is it true that you studied French and Russian at the University of Sussex?
Yes, it is. I actually got a place, and I actually flunked my A-levels. I was predicted to do quite well, and I flunked them because as I went into sixth form, it became from a boys' grammar school, it became co-ed, and I discovered girls, and quite frankly, that was the end for me. And I was more important trying to be cool in the sixth form common room and failing than I was to actually study. So I did French, German, economics. I got the French and German. So I did a course called French in European Studies. And then you had to take a second language in the second year. So there was I enjoying university life to the full after the first year. In the second year, the morning that you had to go down to choose your language, I'd actually overindulged the night before, spent the night with a bucket next to my bed, thought it's okay, they're open till midday, I'll pop down about 11:30 and sort it. Got down there and the tutor down there said, Russian or Latin? And I said, Italian, please, because that was the choices. And they said, unfortunately, Italian's full. And I said, what do you mean it's full? So the fact that I hadn't managed to sort out my social life and my drinking habits meant I was left with those choices. So I decided to go for Russian because I thought it's a live language. I can get on with it. So, yeah, I did that in the second year, but that's a horrible language to learn, the vocabulary, everything about it. And within 2 terms of doing that, I decided that it really wasn't for me. And by then, I started to get interested in radio as well. So the two collided. And I was very lucky. The vice chancellor of my school actually granted me a year out to go and look and to pursue the radio career with the option to come back a year later, which is quite rare. It was only done for bereavements usually or that kind of thing. So I was very supported by the university, and they keep your place open for 10 years. So 10 years later, I'm coming up 29 now, and obviously have managed to, forge the career in radio. Would you like to return to your place doing French and Russian? I just declined like News of the World reporter and left. So that was it.
Well, I mean, let's talk about how that they allow you that year off to go and search, and find your dreams. I mean, where did you even start?
I started on university radio, so that was the key. I went to one of their meetings. I thought, this is fun. They had a proper university radio, and I just got involved with that. And I quite fancied doing the breakfast show. I thought, well, this is where I want to do a breakfast show. Well, the breakfast show when you're at university doesn't start till 10 a.m. Well, most breakfast shows are finished there. This was the student breakfast show. So I would do 10 till 12 because I was in the arts department of the university. I only had about 4 hours scheduled stuff a week. So the rest of the time was make sure you go to the library and do your work. Well, I was spending all my time at the radio station thinking it was loads of fun. So that's how I started. And the university had a link with BBC Radio Sussex. Once a month on a Sunday afternoon, they had a link up with the university, and they'd have a student access program. So the students would go in and create packages and all speech, no music. So I would go in and engineer that, never on air, just engineer that and press the buttons and that kind of thing. And I quite enjoyed that. And that's how the link came with BBC Sussex. And that was my first kind of venture into any what I would call proper radio.
And did you know at that point that it was for you, that Russian and French could, kiss your backside? It was definitely radio all the way.
I remember going home for the weekend on the train to my mum and dad, who were desperately supportive of me. My mum beyond belief. And I went home one weekend and I said, look, I'm going to leave university. I'm going to give radio a go. And my dad was absolutely adamant that I should get a qualification, even if it were a broadcast qualification behind me. So I applied to Highbury College in Cosham, in Portsmouth. They had a journalism 1-year course, and I managed to get a place on that. There were only 12 places a year, but I didn't want to be a journalist. I wanted to be rich and famous and play tunes. That was, where I thought I'd end up. None of it obviously ever came true, but I didn't want to do the journalism. So I actually turned it down in the end. And my dad said, oh, you need something behind you. And my mum, I remember to this day saying, John, I don't care what he does. He can empty bins all his life for all I care. As long as he's happy, that's what I want out of it. So I got on that train on the way back to university, and I went in the next morning and I said, this is it. I'm not coming back. By then, I managed to speak to one of the guys at BBC Sussex, and they said, we can actually offer you writing the careers guide for the afternoon drive show. So I was just sat there writing scripts and doing this for the afternoon drive show, all completely voluntary. And then it was just luck rather than anything. But you know what? You just made yourself a nuisance, and you just turned up even when there was nothing to do. And you went, oh, hi. They go, what are you here for? And I said, I don't know. You make up all excuses just to get upstairs to the broadcast level. And then Gareth Rogers was the guy. I remember his name now. He said, the studio's free if you just want to pop in. It's off air, so you can go and, this is a dream for me. So while most of my mates were out clubbing in Brighton, on a Saturday night where I knew there was availability, I'd go in with a Chinograph and some splicing tape, and I would reclaim tape because you'd reclaim the old spools in those days. And I would sit there and I'd be like a pig in the proverbial because I just thought this is where I'd love to be. So that was really the in to at least being somewhere in a radio studio.
I often ask my guests, many of them talk about what it was that they loved about radio before they got into it. What was it that you loved so much?
it was the thought of being, I think we've all done it. If you're a radio person, I used to sit in my bedroom. I'd take the top 40 of Radio 1. I would then take that to 2 cassette recorders, and I would regurgitate the top 40 or the top 20 as it was in those days, with me doing the links and actually pressing play on one cassette player, stop, then on to the next one, then back and forward. And that was it. I just wanted the thought of playing music, and ultimately your own favorite music, was just something that I thought was great. And, I grew up on the very BBC, as I say, BBC Radio Bristol was all I had. There was no commercial radio around in Somerset. And in fact, even when I moved to Brighton, Southern Sound, as it was, had just launched 6 months ago. So commercial radio, I'll be honest with you, was completely new. I thought it was cheap. I thought it was nasty because it wasn't the BBC. And that's where I'd grown to listening to in the morning. But then obviously I listened to Luxembourg under the covers when I was a kid. Radio 1, the excitement when they said the Radio 1 Roadshow was coming to Exmouth, which was one of the closest seaside resorts we could get to, or Lyme Regis. And you'd pile down there, Mum, Dad, get me in the car. I want to go to the Radio 1 Roadshow. And you'd sit there playing around with bits and pieces, go, wow, this is brilliant. And I think ultimately, I just thought, this looks like a kind of job where I don't have to work too hard and for too many hours. And my mantra in life as I get older as well is minimum input, maximum output.
I'm going to have that on my gravestone, I think,
yeah.
when it eventually happens.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's interesting you talk there about thinking that the commercial radio, I mean, it just started in the South.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sounding cheap. So when did it happen that you moved from the BBC? Because you go to Southern Sound next, don't you?
Yeah, what happened, again, it's luck. It's pure luck. There was a lady who was working at BBC Radio Sussex, and I'd by now cut all ties with the university, so I was just hanging around. I knew that was never going to be where I was going to be because it was a BBC local. And I think the youngest person on there, ironically, was Julian Clegg, who did many, many years on BBC Radio Solent as breakfast. And I have to place on record, he was the kindest man to help me and to show me the ropes. And he was presenting at the stage. I think he'd come from the BBC or the National Broadcasting School or whatever. But anyway, there was this lady who said to me, look, my partner is programme controller for the new commercial station, Southern Sound. He's got a little bit of work and it's paid. Music to my ears. Would you be interested in saying hello? And I said, of course I would. So I went over to Port Slade. I met a wonderful man called Vince Geddes, sadly no longer with us. And my initial work on Southern Sound was to play out off of reel to reel some Sunday evening programmes, 2 of those. And then in the week, I was a tech op for an amazing broadcaster called Timbo, who used to do shows on Radio Essex, and then he was on Radio Mercury and Southern Sound, and they shared evening programming. My goodness, maybe the first and earliest form of networking. Who knows? But it was really good. So he was talking down the line to me in Crawley. So as we went to a commercial break, he would fire his end. I would fire the old similar 8-track carts with all the ads on them at my end. But obviously at that stage, nothing digital, all analog. Our ad breaks would be different lengths. So at the end of it, if I was short, I'd have a catch-up bed, would be like a bit of incidental music that you would bring up after the last ad and wait until he caught up with you, or vice versa, you caught up with him. It was so desperately basic. But that was it. And I was working 6, sometimes 7 nights a week. So social life went out the window. But you know what? I had my foot in the door. Then the head of music at Southern, a chap called Luis Borges Cardona, who's been very successful since with podcasts on the BBC. And in fact, we met up for a reunion not so long ago. And I said to him, I said, Lewis, can I do the weather at midnight? Because at midnight, you would actually close down, run round to the racks room, press the sustaining tone, and midnight till 6 a.m. was just tone, nothing, no programming.
Wow.
It wasn't a 24-hour-a-day operation. So I said, can I do the weather off the news at midnight? Yeah, so I got to speak on air. So I'd do the weather. Thank you for listening. We're back at 6 o'clock in the morning. Everything was fine. Then, of course, I pushed my luck and I said, Lewis, could I play a song as well after that? Just a relaxing song, just to send everyone, Yeah, be careful though. You let me know what it's going to be. So it would be Scarborough Fair, Simon and Garfunkel, something like that. Very, very, relaxing. And then one day, I can't remember what I chose, but I blew it because it was not relaxing. It might have been something like Love Like Blood by Killing Joke, because I liked it and I wanted to play it. And the next day I got hauled over the coals. And it was, you will now bring in every song that you play after that weather, and I will check it over. But you know what? I'd managed to play a song and do something on air, and that was absolutely marvellous.
So tell me about your time. How long were you at Southern Sound for?
I was there, my first shift, paid shift, I think. I got a call from Vince one evening saying, the guy who did early breakfast is ill. Can you come in and do it? And I'm thinking, I said, can I choose a different one? Because it's 10 o'clock at night now. And no, it's either this or you don't. So I went in and did that in June 85. And I stayed there on evenings, basically 6 till 9 until August, September 89. During that period, Southern had changed from what I'd call a hot AC station into Southern Sound Classic Hits. So I was playing a lot of Celine Dion, that kind of stuff. And for a 24-year-old, I didn't want to be playing that. I'd drive up to London at the weekend, and I'd hear Neil Fox on Capitol and people like that, Martin Collins. I think, wow, look at these hot rocking jocks. And I remember Mark Franklin, who was the program controller at the same time, he called me in one day. And he said, look, you need to sort out your presentation because you sound like a second-rate Neil Fox. To me, that was the biggest compliment I could ever receive. For him, he was trying to actually hammer home, we're not hot rocking station. So at that point, I thought maybe it might be time to look around. And that's when I sent off a demo to what Chiltern Radio were launching, Horizon Radio in Milton Keynes. And that was going to be a dance station. I mean, I didn't really like dance music, to be honest, but it was a station. But yeah, I sent the demo off, and then I got a call from Paul Robinson's PA, and I went up to a meeting in Milton Keynes before the launch, and then got offered mid-morning on there, 10 till 2. It was a culture shock. I'm a Somerset boy who'd grown up when he was 18 there, moved to Brighton back in 83, 84. That was a big change. It's a big city. Wow. And then suddenly, after I just got used to that and I bought my first flat, I'm suddenly being moved up to Milton Keynes, which at that stage, the road system actually could take all the traffic and a load more. But it was a weird place, Milton Keynes.
Well, I was going to ask what that transition was like, because, you've described it beautifully there. It must have been a completely different world for you.
Yeah, it is. And, I always compare, not so much now, but in those days, the life of a radio presenter, very much like a footballer. You go where the work is. And if your transfer takes you to another part of the country, so be it. And that's what it did. And, I was horribly homesick. I kept my flat and I rented it out. And I rented it to a friend so I could go back. I finished at 2 o'clock on a Saturday for 6 days a week. I'd drive back down to Worthing, have Saturday night and Sunday in Worthing where I was living. I'd do the quiz at the pub on a Sunday night, get my head down early in the spare room, which my friend would still rent out to me, even though I was renting it to them as a flat. I think it worked. And then I'd be up at 5 o'clock on Monday morning to get back up to Milton Keynes to be on air at 10 a.m. So I hate it. But then you just gradually transition, and Milton Keynes becomes your life, and you end up, it was a very young station, a very young demographic to broadcast to, plenty of opportunities to work in the clubs and everything. And that's when I thought, wow, this is it. This is it.
So, so from there, down here we've got Chiltern, the two Chilterns, Northants, Seven Sound, as you mentioned there. So what shows were you doing? So you went to Horizon to do mids, and then where next?
So then once they decided under the auspices of an absolutely lovely man, the most amazing radio pioneer, Colin Mason, who is still going strong, and I've kept in touch with ever since. He's an amazing man. He's very quirky. He was very much and still is involved Territorial Army. And he had a very sergeant major feel to it. And in Dunstable, I remember we used to share some programming, and I popped down to Dunstable to do a show. I was sat in the studio once, and he crept in on his hands and knees into the studio with a rolled up piece of paper, threw it at me, and went, because we had a security system on the doors. That could have been a bomb. That could have been, you could be dead now. And I said, oh, it's a piece of paper. And who's going to get, oh, you did not shut the studio door and lock it. And he was very specific on that. So I did 10 till 2 on Chiltern. And eventually I ended up being on the whole network. So I was on 5 stations. And that was the early days of split ads. So I had 4 cart machines up there. And you would load up all the ads on those. There would be a tech op sat in Gloucester doing the 7 sound. So it was terribly labor intensive. You know, you would be playing the ads, taking all the carts out, putting them back, loading up the next ad, queuing up the next song. I mean, we were just on the cusp of moving from vinyl to CD there. So you had some vinyl, some CD. But what a labor intensive job that was. But that was great. And they were fantastic days. I mean, the stories I've got from, we never earned any money. We never earned any money, never well paid. But you know what? We loved it because we had a feeling. I worked under the likes of Paul Chandler, Clive Dickens, these people who were brilliant visionaries, but they were radio people. They gave you enough rope to hang yourself, and then they'd reel you in. And I remember one incident desperately where I was opening a reopening of a nightclub in Wellingborough, Northamptonshire. This was great. Got to be up there for midnight. Fantastic. So I'm having a bath at 10, getting my togs on, thinking, this is it. I'm opening a nightclub. So I drive to Wellingborough, and Wellingborough is not a large town. It was tipping down with rain. I see the club. I literally see no one else in Wellingborough that night. It's a Thursday night. It is dead. And I think, right, now either they're all in that nightclub and it is banged out to the hill, or there's no one there. You can guess which it was. So I turned up. There must have been about 15 people there. So the owner of the nightclub, who didn't live in the UK, he just invested, met me at the door and he said, I just can't believe this. I don't know why we haven't got people in. And I said, I'm really sorry. And I always remember John Sachs on Capital Radio once said to me, he said, you'll get these gigs where there's no one there. He said, now, you're only I won't use the word he used, but you're only if you're not getting paid for it. If you're getting paid for it, then you go in, you do your stuff, and you leave. So he said to me, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'm here now. I might as well do it. I said, why don't I just go round and speak to everyone individually? And I did. For an hour, I went round that nightclub, which was dead, and just sat with people and had a drink with them. And at the end of it, he gave me my cash, which, of course, was declared fully to the HMRC. And the parting shot, I never remember this, he said, I'm so sorry about that. We'll get you back on a busier night. They never did. And I said, that's absolutely fine. He said, well, I can't understand. He said, I would have thought booking Steve Wright would have brought the people in.
Is this going out or is it just in our headphones?
The hamster's fine. It was a technical problem. You heard something on air you shouldn't have done.
Oh, yeah. So from that network, you go back to Southern FM.
Yes.
But you go as the program director.
Yes, it was. When I was there as a presenter, we had an amazing lineup, and I worked with some amazingly talented people. Chris Copsey, who was on Breakfast, was just a pro. Unfortunately, no longer with us. The likes of Richard Gwynn, who did Mid Mornings, again, sadly not with us, and a chap called Jeremy Scott, Jeremy Corliff, real name, again recently passed away. Brilliant broadcasters. So most of those had moved on, but Chris was still on Breakfast. So I got a call from Clive Dickens, who since had gone to Capital, was working with Richard Parr, and said, how do you fancy coming back and being programme controller at Southern? And I thought, wow, okay, that's quite good. So I went down to Euston Tower to meet Richard and went up the fabled curved staircase at Capital. All the time walking up there thinking, oh, I wish I was walking up here to be a presenter and not a program controller. You just think, oh, my goodness. Went and saw Richard. He offered me the job. I got back on the tube. Clive phoned me, did it go okay? I said, yeah, I've got the gig. Brilliant. Can't wait. So I went back to Southern. That period of being at Southern and then moving over to Ocean Power, the most unhappy time of my life.
Oh, really?
Really was unhappy. Again, it's the analogy of the footballer. You get to the end of your playing career, you hang up your boots and you become a manager. And from doing 3 hours a day, and having no cares in the world. Suddenly you're working for a large group. You're working under the auspices of Richard Park and Clyde Dickens, formidable. And you are having to implement group policies that at a local level might not necessarily be that popular. And I had to go in, and one of the first jobs I had to do was to try and move staff presenters who've been on staff a long time into freelance contracts. You know, we all know why that happens and what the end result is, but trying to get those, and you know, there were presenters, and Chris was one of those, Chris Copsey, and we had horrible slanging matches. It was horrible because I'd been a colleague of his and a good friend. Suddenly I'm the big bad ogre who comes in, and I'm lording it about, in his words, and he was right, but I had to, because then I had above me Richard Park and Clive Dickens saying, we need this done, we need you to do this, you know. So I didn't enjoy it. My MD at Southern, still in touch with him, a lovely man, Bob Hose. He understood. He was very supportive. I tried to be as supportive of commercial as I could as a programmer, because they were notorious program directors for not wanting to be commercially led. But I realised that if I could get the revenue through the door, that was going to help me ultimately keep a job, because that's how I get paid. So then I moved to Power and Ocean. Power FM at that time was one of the biggest brands in the country. It was cool. It had that amazing up to the top of the hour sequence. It was the station every young jock wanted to work on. I would much rather have been presenting, but again, I was programming it. We had some very successful times. And Richard Park would come down and spend days with me, you know, mentoring me and helping me out. And Richard was amazing. He just had this knack with music programming. And Power FM was just nothing but currents, basically. If you played anything older than 2 years old, it was just as a one-off for a decision.
I do want to talk more about Power, and I would like to talk a bit about Richard Park as well. Just before those, did you ever think about going into management, or did the opportunity just arise and you thought...
It just arose. And I'll be honest, I was flattered that Clive called me. I was flattered that Richard Park wanted to see me. And I'd already taken on the management role at Chiltern. I'd become what was called the network controller. So actually, I was head of music. When Clive left to go to Capital, Paul Chandler, who was head of news then, became the program controller and director of the whole group. And I became what was called network controller, for want of a better expression. So I'd already moved into semi-management, but I was also doing 5 shows a week. So it was full on, it really was. But that was where I started to forge relationships with record companies and, you know, have the odd free CD here or there, or be invited to an artist showcase in London. So you're thinking, hang on a minute, I'm only being invited to this because I'm doing the playlist. So there was that degree of, yeah, this is quite fun. And then I had to make the decision when I got the offer, do I go full-time into management and just knock the broadcasting on the head? Or do I stay where I am? And I'll be honest with you, John, the lure of the company car and the pension and the share options and, you know, that kind of stuff. And I thought, yeah, I think maybe it's time. I was, 29, I think, by then. And I thought, yes, I'm going to give it a go. And as we say in life, you know, every sliding doors moment, what would have happened if I'd stayed at Chiltern? I don't know. Ironically, the money wasn't that much more than I was on. It wasn't like moving from Chiltern, which was kind of, you worked for the fun of it, but that wasn't the driving force for me. Moving to Capital at that stage wasn't suddenly megabucks, but it was just, and also it was the thought of moving back to the South Coast as well. And I felt I'd done my time in Milton Keynes, and I thought, you know, maybe it's time to go home, so to speak. So that was the deciding factor on it.
Do you know, not once have we had a guest on Crunch and Roll who has said a bad word about Richard Park. And he has this... There are a lot of rumours, you know, of things that have happened. And I thought when we started doing Crunch and Roll that a lot would perhaps slate him, but not one person has as of date.
Oh, don't get me wrong. Richard is a complex, or was a complex person in that period of his life. He could be difficult. You certainly did not cross him in any shape or form. You knew when the phone went, and these are the days where I had a PA, my own PA specifically I used to, Lorraine, lovely Lorraine, and she'd go, what would you like me to do? And I said, I don't know, should we go and eat some cake somewhere? Because I've got nothing for you to do. I've done Selector. But she was like, I need to do stuff. There was I'll tell you in a minute where we came into our own, but she would bring through. So I've got Richard on the phone for you. And there was always that moment of dread where Richard came through and, everyone does their impression, but it was a dear boy, good morning. And he could be very good with psychological warfare. So on Radar Day, all the program directors from Southern, Invicta, Ocean, BRMB, Capital, we'd all go up to London, to Leicester Square by then, and we'd sit in a room. Now, my MD already had the results out. They'd come out at 10 o'clock, but I'm on the train to London at 10 o'clock. I don't know my results. So he would come and he'd drop the envelopes on the desk in the meeting room in Leicester Square. Well, have a look at those, and I'll be back in 10 minutes. So you'd grab the Radar results, the first time you've seen them, and you'd look at everyone else in the room. You'd look at the scores and think, oh, God, 35 54s have died a death, this. And then I'd look at, for example, Mark Sadler, who was at Southern by the time I was at Ocean Power. I'd look at him, and everyone would play poker face, and they wouldn't want to give away. Well, Richard would then come in, and he would say, so, Steve, tell me about your top-line figures. What are you thinking? I'd say, well, I'm glad that we can report growth in the 15-24 females. I like the fact that what I've introduced into the drive show at 5 o'clock seems to have created a bit of a spike. And you'd think of it just off the top of your head. And he would turn around and go, really? Surprised you're saying that. I went, no, Richard, what I'm actually saying is completely the opposite to that. It was psychological warfare, and he knew how to work you. But then he was very supportive, and he would back you to the hilt with any problem you had within the dynamic of a commercial company. And he stuck up for me very majorly on one incident. And then when I eventually decided to leave there, and I just got up one morning and went, I don't want to do this anymore. He was actually on holiday. And somebody said, well, you're going to wait till he's back, aren't you? And I said, I can't. I need to go. It was just after New Year. I said, I need to go. So I handed in my resignation and everything. And when he got back from holiday, he phoned me and he said, there's nothing we can do to change your mind. I said, no. And he said, that's fine. I understand. And he wrote me a lovely letter. And I went up to London, went out to lunch with him. Didn't need to do that. Didn't need to do that at all. And then I met him a few years later at an awards do, and he remembered me. And I mean, you might go, well, why wouldn't he? But, the number of people that he'd met in his... So, he was incredibly supportive towards me. Yes, he could be awkward. Yes, he could be arrogant. But you know what? As a programmer and as a boss, you knew where you stood, and you knew what came out of those speakers was going to be good, and it was going to be big. That's what the sound of any station that he programmed had a big sound to it.
Let's talk about power, because I mentioned at the top of the pod that I, being a dirty northerner, I knew very little about the southern stations apart from power.
Yeah,
everybody knew Power FM, and it was, even for me, a lad from Hull, I wanted to be on Power.
Yeah.
What was it about Power that was so great?
I think that its halcyon days coincided with some brilliant years in music. So the fact that you had to rely primarily on the currents and the recurrence and the odd oldie. We played the odd 80s oldie on there. But I think we were blessed with a great database of music. We had some very good presenters, really, really good presenters. And above all of else, we had some amazing production. I'm not a production nerd. I'm not a production freak, but I can tell good production when I hear it. And there was brilliant production. And the little clever tricks, I wish I'd come up with them. They were there when I joined, of this sweeper up to the news, not having news on the hour, having it before the hour. So while everyone else was doing their religious old style ILR bulletin, we were already into a song. Big five songs out of the news, sometimes 10 out of the news. It was just the whole sound of it. And you're right, because everyone wanted to work there, there was no shortage of talent coming through. I had the likes of Andy Sheldon, Darren Parks, who's still working in this industry. One of my proudest people that I took on was Des Paul, who's still working in many, many facets. We reconnected recently. I went to his 50th birthday party. And you know what? You look at people like that. And he thanked me for taking him on, because in those days, you just had cassettes sent to you. And I just said to Lorraine, I said, what do you think of this guy? She said, he's cool, isn't he? I said, yeah, really cool. So we got Des down. Of course, he was so darn cool in real life as well. I hated him. It was like, oh, you're amazing. And he was just brilliant. People like that. Nick Goodman, who's now a very big consulting, he did the power music, to be honest, because I was very happy, going back to the initial minimum input, maximum output. I was always happy to delegate. You know, I probably was threatened, but I didn't feel threatened because I had these guys who were so good. I had Ocean as well, and it was always known that in the building that Power FM was my favourite child, and Ocean was just a slightly older child that actually, you're into the boring stuff, are you? No, I want the young child. I want to be with the young child. So, but I had some great people on Ocean as well. The likes of Spencer Kelly, who's presented Click on BBC for many years now, Mark Walker, who's still going strong in the industry, and these are people that their careers have continued, and there've been a lot that gone by the wayside. But Power FM, and then of course we had the birth of Power in the Park, which was on Southampton Common, which was a free music festival. When I look now, we had a great guy called John Probin, who was event management for BRMB. So he would come down, and we would build, not literally, but the stage would be built on Southampton Common. It was free. Anyone could come. There were no barriers, nothing. I mean, health and safety today would just have a field day. And the biggest year, we had over 100,000 people on that common over the day. Lorraine and I put that together, just the two of us, sorting out all the acts and the artists and spending weeks and weeks putting the thing together. And then Mark Sadler, who had done BRMB's version of it, BRMB in the Park, he would come down and do the daytime management of the stage, and I would just swan around backstage and enjoy myself. So we had some great, they were great days, and the Power in the Park over the years just became huge, and then went around the park. We had Southern FM doing Power in the Party in the Park. That was it, Party in the Park over in Brighton. But Power in the Park was just a huge thing, and that cemented, those are one of the earliest days, really, of live events coexisting with the radio station. They were just brilliant days, really were.
I always thought as well with Power that it had that skill of owning the area that it was broadcasting to, which only a handful of stations really, managed to pull off. I would say that Galaxy 105 really managed to own Yorkshire. But on the South Coast, Power, that was your hood. I mean, nobody was dipping their toe in there.
No. And that was done. And in fact, some of the tricks that we did on Power ultimately did transfer to Wave 105. For example, when I was there, we made sure that you didn't say Southampton. You mentioned where specifically in the Southampton it was. Was it Bitton? Was it Sholing? Was it St. Mary's? So therefore, that micromanaged it. If you were listening in Portsmouth, you would kind of roughly know where that was, but you might not. But so what if you don't know? But if you lived in Bitton and you heard Bitton mentioned, wow, they really are my local station, and they are talking to me. And the local presenters, they knew their patch. For some reason, we hit a moment where everyone wanted to be part of the Power FM party, whether that was the listener or the people within the building.
Yeah. Or every other jock in the country.
Or every other jock in the country, yeah. Did I ever get a demo from you?
No, you didn't. No, you didn't.
We're having a party. Oh, yeah.
Obviously, it poses the question, why did you want to leave?
Because I wasn't happy. I wasn't happy. And I'll tell you the point at which I decided to leave. We needed a new Power FM presenter, and we'd been looking around the country, and we had identified Richard Pocock, who was on 2CR at the time, now Rick Jackson. And I remember Richard and I saying, right, I think he's our boy, isn't he? And he said, yeah. And he phoned me on a Monday. I was on holiday, which I remember. He said, oh, Steve, when are you going to get hold of Rick? And I said, well, I'm on holiday this week, so I'll do it when I get back. Well, wrong answer, of course. I'm surprised you're saying that, Steve. So I said, okay, I'm going to get hold of him now. So, I bit into my holiday. I met Rick at Rownham Services on the M27. I remember it well. And we signed there and then. I had the contract in my pocket. and Rick became Power FM. Then he moved on to breakfast. And the moment I decided it was time to go out was when I was renegotiating Rick's contract for Power FM breakfast, with the words ringing in my ear from Richard, make sure he gets what he wants. So he did get what he wanted. And at the end of the contract negotiation, I'd realised that he was now on 10 grand a year more than I was, to present 6 till 10 Monday to Friday, no weekend shifts, and to go home and enjoy his life. I, however, was in the building, and I was driving from Worthing at that stage to Fareham. For those that don't know the area, that's about an hour in rush hour. I was in the building, often suited and booted for meetings at 7:30, and I'd often not leave there till 7 o'clock at night. And I just came to the point again with the football analogy. Hang on, I'm the manager. The players are getting far more than I am and having far more fun. And I just thought, no, I don't want to do it. And I actually left with nothing to go to. In fact, I gave up a very big share option deal if I'd stayed for another 3 years. But the money was never important. I just wanted out. I just couldn't do it anymore. And that was it. And that was the point that I set up Talk of the Devil, which is the umbrella company that I work under. And I'd already worked for a friend of mine at Virgin Records called Martin Finn, who we very sadly lost recently. Lovely man. And he came to me and he said, you've done some interviews in your life. And I said, yeah. He said, if I stick you 50 quid, will you train a new band we've got? What you think might be quite good. This was 1996. And I said, yeah, sure. So I went up to some studios in Kilburn and sat with these girls and helped them and gave them a little bit of a nudge and what to say and what to do. And those girls had a single out 2 months later called Wannabe, and they were the Spice Girls.
Oh.
So, sheer luck again. I got my 50 quid. And then I got a call from another record company. This is after I've just left. So I'm starting out in business and I had 2 or 3 strings to my bow. And they said, do you do media training for bands? I said, yeah. They said, who have you done recently? And I said, the Spice Girls. Great. We've got about, I said, would you like to see my work? I can do it. No, fine. That's all we need to know. So so that was media training with bands. And I did well over 200 bands. Some of them never even got to release date. They were just dropped. They're lost leaders, but the likes of anyone from, Westlife, Boyzone, Bewitched were the initial kind of tranche of bands. Then you would go into S Club 7, so I was doing what I would politely call the candy ass type of bands. But then I moved into the likes of James Blunt, Paolo Nutini, that kind of thing, which was really interesting. And I did that for quite a while. And along with that, I managed some presenters. I say in inverted commas managed. I used to get their demo tapes, and they were still cassettes in those days. And when I left Capital Group, I said to Richard, "Can I send you some demos of people? I'll only do 3 a month." He said, "That's fine." So I would send him 3 a month, and he said he'd write back or just drop me an email. Okay, can you tell them they are absolutely crap, and I never want to hear from them again? Okay, so I would phone the presenter. I'd say, right, Richard's got your tape. Look, it's not good news. He never wants to hear from you again. And the response, honestly, from the presenter was, but he did hear me, didn't he? I said, oh, yes, he heard you. Brilliant. Richard Park heard me. That's all I cared about. So the fact they'd been blown out of the water didn't matter. Their tape had got to Richard Park, and they knew he'd listened to it. So that was good. And I used to do critiques of demos as well. So it was a kind of mix, a potpourri of stuff that I would do just to keep busy. And then to get back into presenting, Bobby Hayne was director at Virgin at the time. And he phoned me up and he said, have you got any cover jocks? We need some cover jocks. So I sent a few demos and he said, no, none of those. He said, now Russ Williams, who was obviously with Jono at the time, he said, no, Russ was on mid-morning by then because Chris Evans was on. He said, Russ said you used to jock with him at Southern Sound. I said, my goodness, that was years ago. I haven't presented in 5-6 years. So I borrowed a friend's studio and sent 5 or 6 links up. And he phoned me back and said, when can you start?
Wow. So
I ended up doing probably 6 months of all kinds of cover up there, mainly late night, mainly overnight, 1 till 4:30 in the morning. My God, I was back on the radio and I was on AM nationally, FM in London. And you would sit there at 3 o'clock in the morning and the phone would go and it would either be the farmer in Norwich, it would be the drug addict in Glasgow, or it would be the insomniac from Belfast. But you know what? You knew that you were reaching. It was, wow, I'm on national radio. And then there was the ultimate sliding doors moment. And Bobby Haynes said, look, we got covered for the rest of the year. Whoever goes next, you've got a good chance of getting their slot. And then I had a phone call from a friend called Lee Cornell, an Australian guy who'd worked with me at Ocean for a while under Richard's guise. And he'd taken over as program director at Wave. And he said, I need a new job for breakfast. Would you hold the fort for 3 months while I go looking? And I thought, I don't know what to do. So I had to choose between Wave and Virgin, and neither of them were going to be permanent positions. And for some reason, and I still can't tell you, John, why, I chose Wave. And 25 years later, I can't complain.
Did you dream of getting back on air after the management thing?
Yeah, well, I didn't think it would ever happen because I thought you've removed yourself. We all know what it's like. You're off air, and your name disappears pretty quickly. And I hadn't been on air by then for probably 5 to 7 years. So I had doubts in my own ability by then because radio had moved on. Could I do it? Could I actually go back on? So, yeah, I went back on to Wave. I knew I would like to do it. And I thought, well, I'm terrible in the mornings, but I'll do breakfast for 3 months. And Wave at that stage was a very different animal to how it's ended up. It was very much a hybrid talk and music format. And it didn't play normal music, as I would call it. It would be quite cultured music, very adult-orientated music. So you would get a lot of stuff on there that wasn't even released as a single. So it was a very niche format, really, at that stage. And the breakfast show would have like Sarah McLachlan with Building a Mystery. Wow, that's a big hit for breakfast. Followed by me talking about the potholes in Southampton, or the Spinnaker Tower being late for opening in Portsmouth. So it kind of almost had a little bit of a BBC local breakfast feel of it at that stage.
I mean, 17 years at breakfast. I'm going to be honest with you, Steve. I messaged quite a few of my friends who work in the industry and said, look, we want to get somebody on from the South. And every one of them said your name. And I think that is because you are a legend.
I battered them into submission.
No, not at all. You are a legend, especially, on the South Coast. I mean, talk to me about, so long on breakfast and your time at Wave and
yeah, look, we obviously the end is nigh. March 28th is D-Day for Wave. It will transition into Greatest Hits. The transition on air has already started. I have absolutely no axe to grind with Bauer. As a parent company, they have been great, even to the point now that they could not have done this in a more human, nice way. And that might sound, for a lot of people, and I know, Digital Spy can be what a place to read, and I have absolutely no problem. Bauer have been a great employer to work for, and previous to that, EMAP and the Wireless Group and Scottish Radio Holdings, and before that, the local owners. We did create a monster. And I'll be honest, the fact that stations around us, the Power FMs, the Ocean FMs, all of these stations have become quasi-national brands, meant that Wave, by default, instead of being the biggest region, the least local brand, has taken on the local brand. Because right up until now, every piece of audio in that building, every show is produced locally. We don't share with anything. We have shared in the latter stages a few bits and pieces with Pyro, but we have been the ones sharing. So we've always been the purveyors of it. So we have been a local station, and we created a monster. And that was under the auspices of an amazing man. I've never worked for anyone like it. I never will again. Martin Ball, who was our MD for many, many years. And he's still with Bauer and has climbed further up the company. Wave will always be his baby. He will always have an emotion that you cannot break with that. But he had some amazing ideas. He, again, was a commercial man, but he knew programming. And we've had some amazing program directors in there. Lee Cornell, my Australian friend, Dave Shearer. Now, there's a Northern lad for you.
Yeah.
Northern lad. Hey, Dave Shearer came down. Hey, fella, what are we going to do then? John Dash, again. Yeah. He was program director. Jane Young started it all off. And then most recently, for many years now, Andy Shire, who came to us from Isle of Wight Radio. And, he is right up there. If not, I don't want a league table with Richard Park and John Dash, Dave Chick, because they're all amazing legends. But Andy is right at the very top of music programming. And he will admit he's also been relatively lucky that he's had a stable lineup that has barely changed. And I'm a very firm believer in radio that familiarity breeds acceptability. It doesn't breed contempt. And there are too many radio groups in the past, and maybe some still in the present, that will never let anything bed in. And you've got to give it 18 months, 2 years, not 6 months, not one book, not 2 books. You've got to let something grow. But again, football analogy again, it's like football managers. How long have they got? One transfer window, because if they don't get the results right, you're out the door. So Wave became an absolute monster. It still has been a monster. And we go out with an all-time high, our highest ever listening hours and our highest ever market share. So we can hold our heads up high. I appreciate 40 years in the business of commercial radio. Ultimately, it's more of a commercial decision than a radio decision. If we've been bumping on the floor, I'd have said, fair enough. But I have no issue whatsoever. This is where radio is. And for those, and I do want to say this, for those that live in the past and those that turn up on Facebook pages and think that Bauer and Global are the biggest evils that radio has ever had, and want their local radio. We want local radio. We want local radio. What do you want then? Do you want Tradio or Midday Market back, where people would come on and sell bits and pieces? Oh, no firearms or pets allowed to be sold. Do you want outside broadcasts from carpet showrooms and car showrooms? This was the kind of, you can listen back with rose-tinted headphones. Do you want some of the stuff that we used to do on air, which was terrible? You've got to be careful what you're trying to remember local radio as. And the fact that it isn't local anymore is because the model has finished. Local radio in your eyes, what you'd like to hear, and everyone says, oh, start your own station. Really? Do you know how much that will cost?
Yeah.
And once I've spent all that money, do you know how little I'll make back on it? No. No, that's why the model of traditional local radio has gone, and get on with it. And I've got no axe to grind whatsoever.
I've got to just disagree about one thing.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, Steve. I made quite a lot of money with those carpet shops doing the PAs. I got paid 500 quid to open a Krispy Kreme in the Oracle in Reading when I was at 210 FM. So
fantastic.
It's a lot of cash, dude.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm still up for S&P wherever it comes from. But the OBs that would say, where are we going? We're getting an OB from here. Why? Well, they're paying for it. Right. What does that add to? What will it sound any different on air? Oh no, we don't even mention you here, but we'll set the road show up. The road show. Oh my God, it's just, Wave did stuff like Wave 105 Live at the BIC, and we had live gigs. We did Wave 105 on the beach at the Bournemouth Air Festival. We did some big outside events, but I'm afraid those that still live in the past and lambast the radio groups that are around these days, just think back we did some good local radio, but some terrible stuff as well. And do you know what? It wouldn't survive 1 minute in today's market. Advertising is a premium. People can just go off and target their advertising on Facebook. They can come and, buy into the Crunch and Roll podcast and get advertising and target that with it. Absolutely.
Amen to that.
You've just got to accept that commercial radio, if you want to survive and make money, things have changed.
So, 17 years at Breakfast, Steve, any highlights, any memories that you could share about your time? 17 years is a long time on Breakfast.
Yeah, I started at a young man, and I ended up being absolutely frazzled. And like you know what it's like doing breakfast. It does feel like permanent jet lag. And you get through the first 3 years, and then you get through the next 5 years, and that's 8. And when I think, crikey, I still had 9 years to go on that. It is brutal. It is brutal. I remember talking to Martin Ball, my MD, when I first started. I said, what do you want me to do? Do I need to go out on sales calls at 9 o'clock? It was eventually 5:30 till 9. He said, no, I want you to do your show, go home or go out or do whatever you want, live your life, and then tell me about it on the radio the next morning. So we had some amazing days, but part of the deal, as you'll know, with breakfast is that you're the face on the billboard. You're the one that they do the TV ads with. You're the one they're pushing to create the lovely radio listening pyramid. And that meant that I remember doing like retail awards in Poole at the Marriott Hotel. I'd still be at the bar sharing a glass of wine with an important client at midnight. I'd then go to my hotel room, the same hotel, crash for 3 hours, back up and straight back in. But, you know, I was a young man, and it was really exciting. The longer it went on, and possibly for the succession plan was always for Rick Jackson when he joined Wave to then move into breakfast. And that took maybe 4 or 5 years to really come to fruition. And every year I'd say, I've done enough. And they'd say, oh, come on, one more year. And you know, your health does suffer. And at that time I was diagnosed type 2 diabetic. You know, what a surprise. I wondered I'd got away with it that long, you know. Your diet's rubbish at breakfast. You're always fitting extra meals into the day. You're just not looking after yourself. So when the moment came every year at January, I'd say, that's it now. And then 1 year, Martin said, okay, you're okay. So I had been pushing to come off breakfast for maybe 2 or 3 years. So when I came off of there, I was under the impression I was leaving. And that's what I planned to do. And they said, what about if we just swap you and you do afternoons, 4 o'clock? And it was a real shock. And obviously I took it, and I've done 7-8 years on there now. But it's lovely not setting an alarm anymore unless I need to. It's lovely staying up late beyond 9 o'clock and not panicking about every hour you haven't slept. However, I still prefer breakfast as the slot.
Oh, do you really?
Yes. Just because of the dynamic of the show, the way it moved, the way it developed from being a very much BBC local style thing into being a very traditional commercial breakfast with, and I must mention this lady, Selena Ross, who is my travel co-host, but she's not, she does the travel news, but she's my co-host. And she has been my radio wife for over 20 years. Joe Rawlings, who has been my most recent journalist stroke co-host. So I've had a three-way that has been just amazing. I've had some wonderful co-hosts in the past. These are the two. Certainly Selena has been there as an absolute constant in my life. I talk to her more than I even talk to my own partner. Because you know what? I spend 3-4 hours talking to her non-stop. I get back and I speak to Amanda, my partner, and you know what it's like. You'll speak to partners and everything, but this is concentrated. We've helped each other through some really bad times, personally, professionally, and you just bond with them. So breakfast was always the point. And guess what? You finished at 9 o'clock, and you could come home and you could be in the pub at 4 o'clock and have a few drinks, and then so breakfast was always my favorite because of the dynamic, the speed at which the show went, and also the fact you could get home early. However, I'll trade a bit of that off for being able to lie in bed a bit in the morning.
I had a couple of bosses, Steve, who said exactly the same. They were good bosses who said, I want you to finish your show and go out there. And I think it was Mark's Story that once said, be a sponge and soak up everything and then bring it back on the radio the following morning. And I used to think, well, that's great, but all I do is go straight to bed. I was just so tired.
And to be fair, in terms of where Wave sat in the market and where you've worked as well, it doesn't matter that you went home to bed. You could talk about, God, I had to go to bed at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon. It was only Homes Under the Hammer that sent me to sleep kind of thing that I was watching. That's what the listener relates to. They don't want to hear about I was on the red carpet in Leicester Square last night and all that. And to be fair, the last 8 years with Selena and Joe, none of us have got married. None of us have had kids. So just by fault, really, that's the way it's gone. So I always said to Mark Bull, I said, are you sure punters want to hear about, the listener wants to hear about what we call ourselves, the Barren Knights, you know? And he said, yeah, because sometimes when you're rushing around with a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old trying to get them ready for play school or school, you want to hear about the life you could have had. I said, that's just cruel. But, you know, I would love to have had kids. It never worked out. Now I'm at this stage of my life. I'm quite happy as I am.
It's been fascinating listening to you, Steve. And I'm just sat here trying to work out in my head what your highlight has been in your career. Because you've loved Wave.
Yeah.
You loved Power and Ocean. Let's not forget Ocean. Southern, the BBC was great fun. You know, the Chiltern Network, Horizon. What's the highlight for you?
To be honest, if I look at highlights, I think that some of the associated benefits of being with those groups is some of the stuff, some of the people I've been able to interview through that. And even with Talk of the Devil, having forged the relationship with record companies, people say, who's your favourite person to interview? And that, without a doubt, was Will Smith, who was just the most professional, lovely person. I'm not going to denigrate others who were less pleasant to interview. But I was very lucky. I managed to be part of the first National Music Day, which was way back, and ended up interviewing Mick Jagger in the back of an OB van at the back of the Royal Albert Hall. Wow. And we got a Sony Gold for that. I can't remember the production company that did it now. It might have been Unique, actually. So that was amazing. I anchored the Prince's Trust concert for Genesis at the Royal Albert Hall, which went out over ILR, and I was the link man. I got that for that. So, you know, a dear old mum and dad still in Somerset could hear their son on the radio, long before the days of you know, being able to just, you know, listen online or anything or catch up. This was literally, you had to be in the TSA to hear a station. I've worked with amazing people. I've highlighted a lot of those. John, if you'd offered this career to a 16-year-old lad in Taunton who liked going out and playing, you know, managed to get a gig at a nightclub when he was 16 by lying about his age, and you'd said by the princely age of 59 this year that this was the career I would have chosen and been able to fulfill, I would have bitten your hand off. I really would. I have sliding doors moments. We've had a couple, but I have no regrets whatsoever. And now with the end of Wave as it is, me not being part of the Greatest Hits lineup, I've had to think about what I want to do next. And do I still have radio in my blood? And do I still love the medium as much as I did, even though I can't sell, you know, stuff on the radio at midday, except for firearms and live pets? Yes, I still do. I still love radio. So I'm not ready to retire, and I'm not ready to finish with radio yet. So there's more to come.
It's a great tease. Before I bid you farewell, there is just one more thing that I must talk to you about, because Simon, who is the looks and the brains of Crunch and Roll, is a train nerd.
Yes.
He loves his trains.
Yes.
And he if I don't mention that you presented Train Spotting for Discovery, I think he'd chop my balls off, Steve.
Yeah. And they still repeat them to this day. No repeat fees, by the way. And again, Mark Collins, who's been on Wave, you know, pretty much as long as I have, and he is now part of the new Greatest Hits South Coast lineup in the afternoon. He got me that. He did a series with another Mark, a friend of his. Then the second series, they wanted a new co-host, and they'd done a few screen tests. And he said, "Do you fancy going for a screen test?" And I thought, well, why not? Anyway, I got the gig. And Mark is the train aficionado. I love trains. London, the Tube, I could sit on there all day. Disused London Underground stations, I'm a freak for. I really am. Architecture, platforms, disused stations, that's where I'm at. Mark's more like, you know, he was very jealous when I got to go on one of the first Pendolino trains, the tilting trains, you know. But we did that series, and it was amazing. It made me realise, though, that radio is the medium that I most like, because it's immediate. You might get it wrong, but it's been and gone. TV, a lot of standing around, a lot of waiting, lots of camera shots. Then it's, here's your piece of camera, 30 seconds later, you're done, and you're back to sitting around waiting. But it was brilliant. We got to go everywhere, the Forth Bridge. We went to Germany to see the maglev train, the magnetic levitating train. And we went to Alderney to see their little railway with the old London tube. Just a great experience. So at my epitaph, I can say I did radio, I did TV, I've done a film. I had a role in a film called K-Shop, which is now available on Amazon Prime and actually won some awards at festival. I was only the news anchor and the radio DJ voice, but I have my own IMDb database entry.
Yes.
And stage, I managed to go, I think a lot of jocks were offered this, but I took it. We're offered to go on the run that Spamalot did, the stage, the Monty Python stage musical.
Yeah.
And I actually appeared for it in a few performances at Mayflower in Southampton as not appearing in this show. So I had about 3 lines and I got to sing a song with the cast. So if you'd said to me, TV, stage, film, and what am I missing? TV,
radio.
Stage, film, and radio. Yeah, God, how did I miss the last one? So I've kind of ticked all the boxes now. I'm very happy. I'm very content, but I still have more left in my career. How long I've got left, I don't know. But you know what? The no talent police haven't turned up at my door yet. And every day I get away with it, I'm just grateful.
So, Steve, I often ask our guests on Crunch and Roll who they would like to hear have their own episode. Who would you choose?
There's a couple of people that come to mind straight away. Obviously, I've worked with him now for a very long time. My current program director, Andy's presented. Andy's a very well-known name in the South and has been around. Andy Shire, a great guy who's got some brilliant stories. And also, one of my favourite guys, and we go back all the way to Northampton Radio, is Carl Ems, who does Half 70s Breakfast. Yeah. And his stories of being a 15-year-old, well, I don't want to spoil them, but he started out very young and he's still broadcasting. He's a lovely, lovely guy. And guess what? He loves his trains as well.
Oh, yeah.
Steve, thank you so much for being on.
You're most welcome. Lovely to talk to you as well.
I genuinely thank you. It's been fascinating, and you are a legend. So we're honoured to have you on Crunch and Roll.
Bless you. Thank you, John. You've been listening to Crunch and Roll with me, Steve Pauэр. Subscribe on your favourite podcast app to get every new episode as soon as they drop. Crunch and Roll is a 969 media production, presented by John Fox and produced by Simon Barzowski.
Oh yeah.